Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool with NathanCoolPhoto.com, and in this tutorial I want to talk about triggers. Now this is one of the most asked topics that I get when I'm training other photographers, a lot of emails on this, and of course I cover quite a bit on the triggers in my interiors book on real estate photography. This is going to be a little bit of a long tutorial because I'm going to cover the different aspects and principles of this. If you do have my book on the real estate photography for interiors, you're going to see a lot of this. I'm going to mention that throughout this video because there will be a lot that will go back to that, but I'm going to also cover some other principles that go outside the bounds of that so you can get a bigger picture for that and really try to understand it. First off, to try to understand why triggers can be so complicated for real estate photography is that a lot of the photography industry hasn't been made for real estate photography. If you take a look at weddings, one of the biggest genres, photojournalism, also portrait work, those things typically are one picture. You can hand hold a camera, you can use some type of commander type trigger, and I'm going to get into those also in this video. But when it comes to real estate photography, we do something a little bit different. One, we're going to take a lot of different frames in the exact same place. So for instance, when I'm walking around doing something like this, so here I am lighting a big space, and I need to be able to light different areas and have them shine differently. I'm going to be compositing that stuff together. And so that gets things a lot more complicated than if you were to just take a picture, have full control of where your lights would be for that one instance and that one frame where you're going to be capturing that portrait. Typically you aren't compositing pictures that you're lighting for a portrait or other types of genres. So that's where it gets a little bit complicated. So this is going to be broken down into a few different sections and a few different segments as we go forward. First off though, I'm going to be talking about the triggers as they relate to triggering your shutter, and then I'm also going to be talking about triggers as they relate to your lights. And with that, there's a couple of different ways you can go, and so I'm going to cover those principles as well. But first off, let's talk about the camera. So as we know, in real estate photography, we don't want to really touch the camera. We want to touch it as little as possible. So one of the common things to do is to be able to use a cam ranger. And I've got one here just to kind of show you if you haven't used this before. This is one, and I use the cam ranger for instances where I need to do elevated photography and I can't get near the camera to make a lot of adjustments, because using an iPad or some other type of tablet, then you can control the camera completely. You can change its ISO, you can change the f-stop and all that. But in real estate photography, while that might seem like a good idea, I've found that to actually work against me. Now, it may be something that you're used to using, and if you want to give it a try and see if that can work better for you, please feel free to do so. I've got my own techniques that I've found very comfortable with and get me through properties very quickly. So I set this aside when I'm shooting interiors for the most part. So back to the basics of why I don't do the cam ranger. All we really need to do to actuate the shutter, if we didn't have a trigger, we would just press the shutter release button. So the shutter release that we need to actuate is just one simple signal. So you've seen me do this in my books, you've seen me do this in other videos. I'll typically have a cactus trigger, a very simple trigger that's clipped to my pocket. And I've got these clips, they're just called a visor clip because they would typically go on the visor of a hat, and then they would have a, excuse me, a little screw here that goes into the trigger. But basically I use cactus triggers for that. More on that in a second. Back to the basics, what we're trying to do is just flip a switch. That's all that the trigger is doing. So in place of me pressing a button to actuate the shutter release on the camera, I just need to have something else do that for me. So there are different remotes that you can use to trigger a camera that are wireless, but you want to stay away from anything that's infrared, line of sight, or what they may call optic. What you want is RF, radio frequency. You want something that's wireless and it's a radio frequency. You can then walk around all kinds of places throughout the house and not have to worry about having a line of sight back to the camera. Very useful. But anyways, it's a very simple setup that I use where I've got a trigger that's in transmit mode and then a trigger near the camera that is, in fact, I just keep it clipped onto the center column, and where that's then in receive mode, and that's plugged into then the shutter release port on my camera. All cameras have a shutter release port of some type. It used to be a manual little button that you used to press in the day, but now you can do it wirelessly. So that's what I recommend. And one of the reasons now why do I use Cactus triggers? People say, well, there's cheaper Yongnuo ones, and there's a whole variety. I mean, the world is filled with all kinds of triggers and equipment. That's one of the beauties of photography. But what I like about the Cactus trigger, not only they're very reliable, they've got 16 channels, a lot of other triggers do, but they have a little thumb wheel that's on the side here. You can hear me clicking that. And so what I can do is I can set this set of triggers to one channel, and then I can use my other triggers, which I'm going to get to in a little bit about the lights. I can set those to other channels as well. I can even set dead channels right here from my belt. So anyways, it's what's also known as a dumb trigger, because it doesn't send any information except for flip a switch, actuate the shutter. That's it, very quick. And also then I don't have to have carrying around this larger cam ranger dangling off of here. They do have a pouch you can put it in and all that. A lot of people do find it very useful, and I don't mean to offend anybody that is using a cam ranger. I just found that this is much quicker. For instance, when I'm shooting bathrooms, I can just click real fast, real quick. You've seen me do those shower pops. Well, I can just immediately go boom, boom, boom. I'm not waiting for any pictures to download onto the Cam Ranger. So that's one reason why I like that. But basically, that's the idea there, is if you're using a very simple trigger, this is separate and not related at all to the triggers that you would be using for flash. So once again, it's just a very simple trigger that's in transmit mode and a very simple trigger that's in receive mode connected to your shutter release. So now we've got that part aside, let's get into the more complicated portion of this tutorial, which is going to be talking about triggers as they relate to flash. So now that we've covered what triggers are, the principle of them anyways, as they're related to the camera and actuating the shutter release, now we get into the more complicated area of triggers as they relate to lights. Now, people notice throughout the book, and I get a lot of questions on this, it's like, we use Cactus triggers. I don't understand why the Cactus trigger is actuating the shutter release. How is it firing off the flash? So we'll get to that in a second. But we're going to cover two sections here. And first is what's using the dumb trigger, which is the very basic principle, and that's what the technique that I use using Cactus. And compared to a more complicated one, which has its downfalls, which is using then something for OEM. A lot of lights nowadays have built-in triggers, but they do have some downfalls. Along with that, I'm going to cover then a hybrid approach that you can use either of those. So whether you're going to use just a dumb trigger, whether you're going to use something that's built into the lights, or if you want something that can cover both. So once again, for the basics though, it's just like anything else when we're talking about triggers, is that in its most basic form, to trigger a flash, you need to flip a switch. Now typically you might take, if you were out in the field doing photojournalism, you would take a speed light and you would just put it into the hot shoe of the camera. Easy enough. The camera knows that when it needs to actuate the flash, it just sends a signal, flips a switch, light goes off. Simple. So we're doing the same thing in essence from the camera to the flash, just wirelessly. Just like I had done and shown with the shutter release, where the shutter release has a receiver and it's being transmitted to by what was on my belt. So the same principle is applying. So instead of, though, in this case, where it's the shutter being actuated from transmitter to receiver, the transmitter is on the hot shoe of the camera, replacing where the speed light would have been if you were doing something like photojournalism, and the receiving side is then over at the light. Now, a lot of ways to go on that. We are going to get into that, but let's stick first with the dumb trigger. And this is the method, by the way, that I use. This is what's noted in my books also. And by the way, if you want links to these, if you haven't seen my book, it's my books. I've got right now a 5-part series that may grow over time, but I've got a link to that down in the description for this video, and you can check all the books. Most importantly, though, for the triggers is the book on interior photography, talking about the gear. So let's first talk about the first option, which is the dumb trigger. So using just a cactus trigger like I've had before, using it for the shutter release, I put a cactus trigger up here in the hot shoe of the camera. Now these for the shutter release were set to one particular channel. Remember there's 16 you can choose from. And up here I use a different channel. The channel then that I'm using to transmit to the flashes is the same channel that's used on my lights. And if you notice here, I've got then a trigger set up on the for the speed light, so the speed light can go into the hot shoe of these triggers. Most of them have a hot shoe that you can use, and then also most triggers have the ability to put in a sync port. So I use just a male-to-male 1/8 inch or 3mm equivalent into a cactus trigger, and I just put that into the sync port. All lights have a sync port. Now that may seem a little bit cumbersome, but it is fail-safe no matter what. So whether I was using all flashpoint lights, whether I was using some Yongnuos, whether I was using Einsteins, which would be a little bit cumbersome because they aren't completely self-powered with battery packs, but I've used like Rove lights and other things, and also you don't have to keep up on different brand years where they might then outdate a particular trigger. So anyways, by doing that, I had a lot of versatility, all the various selection of lights that I have. I'm brand agnostic by doing that, and it's very simple. Once again, I just have a very simple transmitter here on the camera, and then receivers are in the for each flash. Now, to trigger it, I have to make sure that the trigger is on, obviously, but what if I don't want to? Like when I take the ambient shot when doing the flash ambient blend. I could turn this trigger off, I could turn these triggers off, but I found it useful just to click that little wheel on the side, and once again, there is just a little wheel, thumb wheel on the side, you can hear me clicking it, where you can just select a channel. So where I might select, for instance, channel 3 to transmit to my flashes, maybe channel 4 to transmit from my shutter release setup so that those two are matched at 4, these are matched at 3. I might set this guy to 2. He's not going to talk to anybody. So by doing that, these guys never receive a signal when the shutter is actuated, and there's no flash then that goes off. So that's the most basic, what's known as the dumb trigger method to, because there's no intelligence that's being sent there, to be able to transmit from the camera to the flashes to make them fire. So where are we so far? Before getting into more complicated, let's just back up for a second. Once again, when I'm actuating my shutter, you could use a cam ranger. I use just a trigger. It's on my belt. He is on a channel that matches this channel for my shutter release that's over on my camera. Transmit mode, receive mode. Up here on the camera, there's a trigger that's in a separate channel. He's set to transmit, and that is the same channel that's used for the trigger on each one of my lights, and those are set to receive mode. But I'm adding triggers to each one of these lights. There are other alternatives to that, but it has a downfall, and that's known as an OEM product or branded trigger. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So if you want to use something that's built into the lights that you have, there's almost always nowadays a trigger that goes along with those lights. Yongnuo has their own brand that talks to their brand of lights. Flashpoint, Godox, same thing. They have also a trigger that talks to their brand of lights. If you mix brands, then that could be a problem. The next option and configuration I'm going to show you in this tutorial can cover that if you need to, as well as some other things. But let's take a look at what that is. So right now, like I was using before, I've got a dumb trigger sitting on my camera. Just a cactus trigger. It's not actually all that dumb, it's just the term that's used for it. And it's just matching a channel over here to the RF signal, so that it just actuates the shutter there. But you can go further using a commander. So this is known, a lot of times they just call these a transmitter. It's actually not the proper term for it, even though that's what they sell them for nowadays. Call me old-fashioned. But we used to call these things commanders. And basically what it is, it's something that slips into your hot shoe, just like that other trigger. There's nothing different about that. So I can just put that into my hot shoe right here. Oh, I seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulty there. Sorry, that happens with my old age. But once that's in your hot shoe, then you can use that as your trigger. Just like I had the other trigger, the dumb trigger, the cactus trigger in there. With this then, there is the ability for me to do a lot of controls. There's a lot of controls, for instance, on this is the Flashpoint R2 Pro trigger, where I can set different groups, I can set different channels. For instance, I could set up, I wouldn't need these cactus triggers. These right here are Flashpoint lights. Flashpoint has speed lights, Flashpoint has mono lights. And so I could just set these lights to different channels, different groups. I could set, for instance, this to group A, this to group B, and then I control when those would fire, if they're going to fire at all. But more importantly, and this is where things get even more complicated and have a downfall, is I could set the amount of power. So if I was using a dumb trigger, and this is typically what I do, I'd walk around, I might be hand holding this as you've seen me do in other videos, and like in these shots here, where I'm hand holding, I'm walking around, I'm firing this thing off, I'm not near the camera, I'm walking around, boom, 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 boom. And all that I would do is I'd spin my little wheel here, or I'd spin my little wheel here, and I'm changing my flash power, and I can just gather a bunch of footage. I might go like quarter power, quarter plus 3, quarter plus 0.7, boom, 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 walk over to the next spot, boom, boom, boom. And I'm not, once again, trying to wait for an image to download from a Cam Ranger, and I'm also not near the camera trying to adjust the power. I'm doing that all manually. This is where the downfall comes in with using this commander. This is fantastic if, once again, we go back to one of the first things I mentioned in this tutorial, which is that other genres of photography can work this very well. If you're doing portraits and taking one picture, that's great. But when you're walking around a house and you're flashing a bunch of stuff, that for me tends to be a little bit more complicated. Also, every time I adjust power, I'm touching this thing. So I'm touching the camera constantly. And that also then adds more possibility, a higher risk that some of my photos might not be aligned. And yeah, I could use auto align in Photoshop, but it's just another one of those annoyances. But the biggest thing is that I can't, once I use a commander like the R2 Pro trigger, the transmitter as they call it from Flashpoint or Godox, I can no longer use the adjustments on my flashes manually. I have to use the power settings from that commander. So that to me gets really annoying because I override that. Now, there could be a particular instance where you could use this and you might be doing like a twilight shoot and you've got inside the house lights all over the place and you're not going to be running back inside the house to do that. I don't use that technique for doing twilights, and you've probably seen throughout my advanced editing book and in my exteriors book, I just don't do that. I use a lot of different frames and I cut stuff in. And, but if you were and doing something special like that, the commander may be the way to go. I don't usually use that. And what I do instead, if you really need to, there's another approach that's hybrid, and that's what I want to cover next. All right, the last setup that I want to talk about when it comes to triggers for flashes is a hybrid approach. This is also technically known as trigger stacking. And just like it sounds, you're going to stack triggers on top of each other. Let me show you one idea here. And this is very common. So once again, if I use just this commander like I showed before, it's great. I've got the ability to change all these various settings so that I don't have to walk out to my lights, but I walk around the house a lot and I'm flashing. So I want to have at least some manual control over that. So you can stack triggers. For instance, I'm going to take this guy off of here, and this is how you would stack a trigger. This is the dumb trigger that I would have normally used, my cactus trigger. So what you do is you just merely stack them on top of each other. Then you just put the one in the hot shoe and you're good to go. Now there's a couple ways I could have done this. I could have left just the dumb trigger on here and used another cactus trigger underneath of here and held that in my hand or had that clipped to my belt. And that way I wouldn't have to touch the camera, I can use the commander. But this type of a setup, it's so versatile. There's a couple things that I can do with it. One, when I have the commander, for instance, let's say I talk to the Flashpoint Explorer 600. So I've got him tucked in a corner someplace. I'm not going to be walking around with him, and I want to be able to adjust his flash setting, but I'm going to be walking around with this guy here. And you've seen me before clip one to my belt. I usually have a speed light clipped to my belt, and I can walk around real quick and add, quick pops where I need to. So I could keep a cactus trigger on him, not have him talking to the commander at all, and what happens then is two transmit signals are sent. The transmit from the cactus trigger is sent to the the receive trigger over here on my speed light, so they're talking to each other and flashing. Simultaneously, the commander on top over here is then talking to the other light that would be used to sync with that, and I wouldn't then have to have this other trigger on there at all. So once again, this guy can talk to the commander, this guy can talk to here, and the possibilities are endless with having this type of configuration. Once again, I could have had this whole setup in my hand. I could have had another dumb trigger just sitting in the hot shoe talking to that. I could have all kinds of stuff going on with then different cactus triggers on different lights, and then different groups that I want with my light here on the commander. And at that point, if that sounds complex and overly complex, I think it really is. No matter what size house I shoot, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000 square foot homes, I never use more than 3 lights typically. It's been very rare that I ever found a need to, because why? Well, we usually shoot composites. So I can shoot a room or a section of a room, and then I can move over and shoot another section of a room. I can move over, shoot another section of a house, and I can composite that stuff together. I don't need to set up 30 lights. So for instance, having these commanders with A, B, C, D, E channels, groups on them, and 16 different channels, I'm not going to have that many lights that I have to control the various power. Also, walking around and doing the pops like I've shown before in my books and in my other videos to do composites, remember one of the basics that I talk about in the interiors book is that light, when we're using flashlight, it isn't always just to get an evenly lit room. One of the basics of that is so that we get the proper color that's being shed on the house, and that helps us with white balance, so that we actually have something that is more accurate color. Then when we add the luminosity on top of it from the ambient layer where we throw the colors away, then we've got something we can blend and have a real impactful type picture. So anyways, I'm not worried about studying a picture and getting it right down to the third stop of light to make sure that it's completely accurate. I want to make sure that it's not blown out, it's not too dark, I get within the acceptable range to do the flash ambient blend. Once again, I don't want to spend a lot of time in a house doing MLS type shoots. I'm not getting paid by the hour for most of those that are under, for instance, 5,000 square feet. Something I talk about, by the way, in the business techniques book when I talk about how you should be pricing stuff. So when in the big jobs, I'm getting paid by the hour, yeah, maybe I'll take a little bit more time, but even then, this just becomes too cumbersome. And there's no way a client's going to have me just fiddle around with like, well, do I do this and maybe tweak that. They want to see me on the move and on the go. So for me, once again, I've found that I don't do the trigger stacking. For me, and what I recommend in my books is just the very simple dumb triggers where we've got a very simple trigger up in the hot shoe of the camera. I've got a combination of triggers that are just actuating the shutter, and it's very simple. If a trigger goes bad, I just replace it. If I get a different brand light, don't have to worry about it. I just pop the trigger in there. But the possibilities are endless, and that's why I wanted to cover all the various scenarios that you could do of just from the principle side of thing. To tell you how to use a trigger, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's little manuals that come with even the most complex commanders, and you can figure that out in about 15-20 minutes after receiving it from B&H or Auto Armor, wherever you order your gear from. But the principle behind it and the possibilities out there is something that I really wanted to convey to you. So I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you found it useful and that you can use some of this in your photography as well. If you did like this tutorial, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost you anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks a lot for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.